Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the Stakeholder Reference Group. Our session today is a live Q&A, and we're going to be focusing on the site review results and a shortlist survey. My name, as I'm sure many of you know by now, is Louise Halfpenny, and I'm the Director of Communications. With me today, we have Helen Brown, Deputy Chief Executive, and Dwayne Passman, who's the Acute Redevelopment Programme Director. Just to have a quick look at what we hope to cover today. Firstly, we have had some questions from you already via our email address here, and that is the way that you can join up to be part of our Stakeholder Reference Group if you are not already a member. Using Zoom, we do have you all on mute. It's not that we don't want to hear you, but we're finding this the best way to manage questions, and we do that via the chat function to myself, Louise Halfpenny. We're going to have a very quick recap from the team, and we're going to keep it as quick as we can because we know that this is an important session and we expect there to be many questions from you. So without further ado, we're going to go over to Helen for a very quick recap.
Hi, thank you, Louise, and good morning, everyone. So yes, I really don't want to say very much at all because I hope that most people who've joined this morning have been, following our progress over the last couple of months. But since we last had a stakeholder reference group meeting, we have published the site review that was undertaken by the Royal Free with Montague, Evans and Curry and Brown. That's available on the website. And also at the end of last week, we published a short engagement document setting out where we are and our proposed shortlist. And along with that, there is a survey that we're hoping as many people as possible will complete. In terms of the recommended shortlist, we are not recommending any of the new hospital sites to be included on the shortlist for emergency care. And that is really based on the findings of the site review about the time it would take and the complexities and risks of bringing any of the new site options into development, taken together with the opportunity that we have to effectively develop very significant new hospital facilities adjacent to the existing hospital at Watford on what is currently the visitor car park and some land owned by Watford Borough Council, which is part of the overall Watford Riverwell development. So that effectively is the position for emergency care, a range of options at the Watford site from business as usual and do minimum, which we're required to include in the shortlist as comparators, and then a range of options from what was the 2019 SOC preferred option of about half new build and refurbishment of the current main clinical block through to options which are effectively all clinical services incorporated into a large new clinical building adjacent to the hospital. For planned care, which you can vary the options, planned care and emergency care, but we've effectively said because the immediate priority and the key most important factor at the moment is improving our emergency care facilities, we haven't included in the shortlist any of the options that we looked at last year for planned care, which reduced from the current 2 sites to 1 site. And people who followed us last year will know that we did quite a lot of work looking at the option of a single planned care hospital rather than the existing 2. But the costs of doing that are quite significant, and given where we are and the priority that we're placing on emergency care and the amount of funding that we've been advised is potentially available in our discussions with regulators, our view is we need to focus on the key priorities at Hemel and St Albans, and then look again in the future at additional investment and whether or not a 2-site solution remains the best way forward for planned care. So in a nutshell, that's where we are with the shortlist, the recommended shortlist. Our board meeting is on the 1st of October. We'll be meeting jointly with the Herts Valley CCG boards, both hearing receiving the report setting out the proposed shortlist, receiving a report on stakeholder engagement and the views that we've received through the survey, taking representations from members of the public in the same way that we have done in the past, and then the boards will consider all of that material before separately then reaching decisions on whether or not to approve the shortlist or whether to make any changes to the shortlist that we've published this week. So the next couple of weeks are really important in terms of getting that feedback from local people, as well as stakeholder reference groups. We have used our communication kind of routes to get it out to as many different people as possible, through the local councils, through our own kind of wider stakeholder list, through community groups. So that's an important piece of work that we're doing. We will then need to collate all of the information that comes back and summarise it, which is why it's really important to us that people do use the survey to give us their views. There is a free text box within the survey, so people can put comments and narrative in there. But it's important to us that people use the survey because that will help us to analyse all of the feedback that we get. So I'm aware from Louise and Priya that we've had a number of emails into our redevelopment inbox with views being expressed, but it would be really helpful for us and much easier to analyse and present consistently the feedback we're getting if people could use the survey. I think I will stop there and we will open up for questions. I know we've already received quite a lot by email, but I'm hoping that also today people will use the chat function. But the last thing I want to say really is on that note, so I've had at least one colleague, member of SRG, express a view that they would prefer to be able to speak than to use the chat function. What Louise and I have discussed and agreed this morning is that we will effectively take a quick opinion poll of SRG members to get a view for future meetings on whether or not you would prefer to be able to speak or whether you're comfortable with the chat function. There are advantages and disadvantages, so we want to take everybody's views into account, and then we can maybe test and try some different approaches in future meetings. So I'm going to stop there, and Louise is going to give us the first question.
Yes, and it's quite a biggie, and it's coming Dwayne's way. So Dwayne, I hope you're ready for this, but the question is, are there NHS guidelines for the size of the catchment area for a hospital based on the density of the population?
Thank you, Louise, and good morning, everyone. That is a biggie. I am not aware specifically of any guidelines for the size of catchment area for a hospital based on the density of the population. It's the way in which NHS hospitals have been planned, certainly for the last 20 or 30 years, is to look more at the overall catchment of a local population and then to size the hospital appropriately based on that catchment population in total.
Thank you. And there's sorry, Helen. Yeah, go on.
Just to add, so I completely agree with Dwayne. It's not really linked to the density of the population, although clearly the size of catchment areas will differ depending how dense the local population is in terms of the geography. The Royal College of Surgeons talks about a minimum 300,000 catchment population to sustain emergency surgery services. I think the Royal College of Physicians talks about a catchment area that's slightly bigger. I'm certainly used to kind of planning, or the majority view on this is that between 300,000 and 500,000 population is what it takes to sustain a full service emergency hospital, partly because of the cost and the workforce involved. So to have 24/7 motors in all the specialties that you need, and also partly because you need enough volume of emergency activity to make sure that all of the specialties see enough of the full range of cases to keep all of the clinical competencies there. So I think the quick answer is, you know, the closer to 500,000 you can be, the better you can deliver a really strong emergency clinical service.
Thank you. And there is a linked question really, which is about the distance from an emergency hospital. So I'll read it out, and it says, is there an optimum time or distance anyone should be from an emergency hospital? Dwayne, can I throw that to you to start with, please?
Certainly. Again, based on what Helen said in terms of population, which you know, between 300 and 500,000, the optimum time hasn't really been defined for most clinical specialties, apart from there's very specific guidelines and evidence around stroke and trauma, and the clinical evidence suggests that getting a patient who may have suffered a major trauma or a trauma, excuse me, or a stroke or a suspected stroke into a hospital and to scan them and start treatment within the first hour of that happening is the so-called golden hour, is the optimum time to do that. So most large general hospitals are within at most an hour from the totality of the population, if you take that as being via an ambulance. I don't know if Helen wants to add to that.
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult question to answer, but I completely agree with what Dwayne has said. I think the other thing to recognise is it does vary significantly depending between urban and rural communities, and I guess Hertfordshire sits kind of halfway between urban and rural, but you clearly have longer travel times in more rural communities, but less people living there relative to in cities where it might take longer to travel shorter distances, but the hospitals are more close together. But there is no one standard that we can go to which says everybody must be X. That doesn't exist.
Thank you. Dwayne, I'm going to come to you with a question about the car park, which is that the questioner says, I thought you already had planning permission for the multi-storey car park, so why has the building not started? And the current parking arrangements were totally inadequate, I think we would all agree, until the pandemic. So could you give us an update on where we are with the car park, please?
Certainly. Thank you, Louise. Enabling works have started on preparing the ground for the car park. We'll be starting, you'll start to see on site contractors working in February 21, and we intend to have it complete by March 2022. So we've been in a process with our regulators in getting final approval because of the size of the investment that's proposed, which is about 41 million. So that's taken us a little while to do, but we've signed contracts and work is underway. And I would agree that current car parking arrangements were inadequate until the pandemic, and our intention is that the new multi-storey will ameliorate and mitigate some of those issues that patients have had on site.
Thank you. And can I ask, please, a question about ambulances and their conveyance? So we were hearing about the amount of time, travel time to hospitals. Perhaps, Helen, you could explain a little about how the ambulance trusts make those decisions about which hospitals to take patients to.
I can try. It would be good to have an ambulance service official response to this, but effectively, ambulances are expected to take, when they respond to a patient, there are target response times to get to the house, and that's obviously really important, part of the overall experience for patients. And then the ambulance crew are expected to take the patient to the nearest emergency hospital. And sometimes that's really clear which the nearest emergency hospital is, and sometimes it's a bit more borderline. And then there are different factors that they might take into account. So if a patient's previously been treated at Watford, then they might be more likely to bring them to Watford. Or if there are specific issues that the ambulance service are aware of in terms of waiting times in different hospitals, they will take that into account. What we do have and we can share is data about what, where our patients come from in terms of ambulance conveyances. I haven't got it right to hand. We'd have to ask for the ambulance service to give us that data. But what we do know is that for residents of Herts Valley, about 55 to 60% of them come to Watford for emergency care, with the remainder going to either Barnet Hospital, Luton and Dunstable, some to the Lister if they're over in the further east of the patch, and also to Stoke Mandeville.
Thank you. I'm going back to the questions now that were submitted in advance, and a really good one here about outpatient clinics. So we know that there will be fewer clinics in the future, and the questioner sort of cites Jackett's Field as an example and says that location is 800 yards from a bus stop down a slope and with inadequate parking. So Helen, perhaps you might give us a comment on what we're doing with outpatients clinics and how they might look in the future.
Yes, so there's been a lot of work on outpatient clinics and what we call outpatient pathways. So the clinicians at the hospital working with the GPs to think about the best way to organise outpatient services. We've made a lot of changes over the last few months as a response to COVID, but these were things that we were already talking about and working on with the GPs. So, for example, the GPs can refer to the specialist doctors at the hospital for advice. It doesn't necessarily need the patient to come in to the hospital to be seen. Sometimes it can just be a conversation between the specialist and the GP. Sometimes we're using video consultation more now, and sometimes even three-way video consultation with the GP, the patient and the hospital specialist. So there are those kind of arrangements that we're putting in place. There are a number of community outpatient services that have been developed over recent years that are provided in a range of locations. But fundamentally, when you do need to be seen by a specialist doctor because they need to do a physical examination or there are specialist diagnostics required, you will come into one of the 3 hospital sites under the proposed configuration of services. Outpatient services at Hemel Hempstead will focus on medical specialties. Outpatient services at St Albans will focus on surgical specialties. We are planning to relocate some of the outpatient services at Watford to Hemel and St Albans. And these are the more specialist bits of outpatients where, regardless of where you live, you would attend. Equally, there are some what we call high volume specialties. So respiratory would be a good example of that, or cardiology, where there are lots of patients needing to be seen, and those will continue to be delivered on all 3 sites. We are going to be talking about the clinical model and engaging on the clinical model later in September, October and November, so we'll be able to give more detail and take people's views and ideas on how we can improve services there, but very much still a commitment to local outpatient services when patients do need to come into hospital, commitment to keep them as local as possible.
Thank you. We have a question about the briefing information that we put out with the survey. which talks about an improvement for the women's and children's buildings. And the question asks, what about the services for men? So do you want to just describe, Helen, some of the real issues that we've got with the women and children's building, and why it might be that we felt we needed to mention that particularly?
Well, the current building is one of our most challenged buildings on the Watford General Hospital site. It was built, I believe, in the 1960s. It's got a whole range of issues that make it very difficult to adapt or upgrade. And effectively, the technical view is that that building, you know, cannot be refurbished and therefore has to be replaced. I think it's probably worth just saying that the key service in women's and children's is, well, children's we take as read, and obviously they're girls and boys that go into children's services. Women's services are maternity and gynecology, and we do deliver more than 4,000 babies a year, so it's a really important emergency hospital service. It needs to be on the emergency site because giving birth can have complications, and you need to be co-located with the emergency care services, and obviously gynecology likewise. So they are very specific services that happen to be for women, and we call them women and children and women's services. Obviously men are very important, and there are a range of services like prostate cancer that apply to men, but they get picked up under surgery.
Thank you, Helen. I've got quite a long question here that was submitted, and it's about St Albans, their local plan. So in fairness to the person who questioned it, I'm going to read it word for word rather than paraphrase it. And Dwayne, I think this is probably something that you could help with. So the question is about the effects of the rejection of St Albans and district latest local plan on the review of sites. Does the latest rejection mean that there is now greater uncertainty around planning permission for, in particular, the Radlett Airfield and Noak Lane sites, for which there are already planning permissions granted in respect of Radlett and proposed for Noak Lane for uses which mean they are unsuitable for a hospital? I hope this makes sense to you, Dwayne. I know you're close to the detail on this. Does this mean that a new build site is now clearly incompatible with improving conditions for patients and staff as soon as possible as a top priority aim for the Trust, given the problems associated with the other sites? And the questioner says they are particularly concerned as they've had major surgeries in Watford and St Albans and have a need for outpatient cancer services. So it's somebody who's experienced some difficulties on those sites and really wants to know what may happen in St Albans as a result of recent council decision. Thank you, Dwayne.
Lovely, thank you. I think first of all, I'd just like to wish the questioner, the person who submitted the question, all the very best for their treatment and the treatment that their partner is having, and hope that that treatment is being successful. So that was the first thing I'd like to say. The second is around, very specifically around the rejection of the St Albans District Council plan. In short, yes, it does mean that there is greater uncertainty around planning permission for those two sites, because really without a local framework for planning that's been adopted and we can hang a planning consent off the back of, it would take us, it would give us significant risk in terms of securing planning consent in the two areas that the question has identified. And it will obviously take time for the council to arrive at an agreed plan and to demonstrate that they've taken into account the views that were expressed by the planning inspectors. As I hope we've been clear, our priorities for urgent investment in emergency care services and in local planned care services in St Albans and Hemel Hempstead, and the two sites that we've mentioned in the site survey, one being our own site and one being the adjacent Riverwell site, are lower risk in planning terms, and the site survey did pick that up. But basically, in answer to the respondents, the questioner's query, yes, it would make it more difficult for us, but we haven't tested that directly with St Albans District Council, as the inspector's letter was only dated 1st of September.
Thank you, Dwayne. I've got a question which is a familiar view. So it says, why are you wasting money redeveloping Watford Hospital, which is not central to the majority of the patients it serves and is an old Victorian disgrace which can never be brought up to today's standards? Helen, could I ask you to have a crack at that question, please?
Yes, Louise. So I think I'm going to take the points in reverse. So Old Victorian Hospital, I agree there are buildings currently on the Watford General Hospital site that are not suitable for the delivery of health services now, let alone in the future, and are not suitable for refurbishment and need to be replaced. In an ideal world, absolutely, I would like to maximise the investment in improving the hospital facilities here, and we have been making that case to regulators to say that the 2019 SOC and the 350 or so million that we had been awarded was a good start and would enable us to replace some of the very worst buildings at Watford, but would still leave us delivering services from buildings that are not ideal. So we are very much making the case to maximise the investment into improving emergency care services. The proposed, our preferred option going into the shortlist, and this is subject to the next stage of work, is for a very, very substantial new build on land adjacent to the existing hospital, such that the vast majority of our clinical services would be delivered from brand new purpose-built 21st century hospital facilities, and all of the Victorian 1960s hodgepodge of not very good buildings would be replaced by that. There are some services and some infrastructure on this site that could be retained, and our newly appointed architect-led design team is doing the detailed work to say, you know, how do we make the best of the site dependent on various amounts of investment. So, for example, our acute admissions unit is just over 10 years old. It probably has got some useful life left in it. One of the things we've asked the design team to look at is both retaining it for its current use, but also if we wanted to pull the services currently delivered in the acute assessment into the new build block, how else might we use that building to support the hospital and the delivery of services? So I do completely agree. If we looked at I block and H block and some of our old Victorian blocks, they're not suitable for clinical service provision, and our proposed preferred option absolutely is for a very substantial new build. So that's the Victorian building. So the other bit is about location and being central to the community that we serve. And I think we have, we've debated this a lot over many years now. I think, yes, in an absolutely ideal world, the hospital would be to the north of Watford, and that would improve access for residents living to the north of us, so Hemel Hempstead, St Albans and beyond. However, when we did the detailed travel analysis last time, overall travel times and even longest journey times don't change that much when you move the hospital. So from a pure travel time analysis, the total time spent doesn't change, although clearly for different people live different distances from the hospital currently, and it would change that. I think the real judgment for us has always been, how much investment can we secure, and what could that deliver, and how long would it take, and how urgent is this? And I make no bones about saying that we believe that the investment is urgently required. the facilities need to be improved, and they need to be improved as quickly as we can. And our view is, taking in the expert advice from the Royal Free and Montague Evans, that we haven't identified a site in a location that is more central to the three towns that we genuinely believe is developable in a realistic time frame to bring the benefits that we want for our patients and our staff, and that we need to take the opportunity that we've got to secure the funding through HIP1 and make really significant improvements. The final piece that I will say, and I know different people will have different views on this, but the new road, Tom Sawyer Way, and the new linking from the M1 has certainly improved ambulance travel times. And I think, you know, it has improved access times for many people, although not for everyone. And I know some people passionately believe that the journey times are too long.
Thank you, Helen. And Dwayne, with all of your experience, can I ask you the question? You've seen the site, you've seen the buildings. Can it be done? Can we bring a modern hospital to this site here at Watford?
I think the quick answer to that question is yes, we can, especially given the opportunity to use the adjacent Riverwell site. Even if we weren't using that, there is still a good opportunity by moving a few services around on the site to create an area that would be large enough to build a modern clinical block on. And we're currently going through a very detailed process of determining exactly how big that clinical block is, and we haven't quite got to the end of that process because we have to go into a different level of detail from the one we went into at the strategic outline case, and get really down into how many individual rooms we'd require. So quick answer to the question is yes, it can be done. With the infrastructure around it, you mentioned, we mentioned Tom Sawyer Way a moment ago, and the improvements that have been made to that communication onto the site. That should allow us the ability to get construction traffic in and not interfere with patient or blue light ambulance traffic. And we will need, as part of any planning application with Watford Council, to be able to demonstrate what additional burden there would be on the roads as a result of construction traffic. Broadly speaking, it's the highest point it would ever be is about 10%, but it does vary very, very much from site to site and is very, very project specific. I hope that helps.
Thank you. And I've got a question here, one that was sent in earlier, about the comparison between the Watford site and a Greenfield site. So possibly stick with you, Dwayne, to start with. So the Greenfield site would be emergency planned. You know, the Greenfield site, as most people think about it, is everything all on one site. And the Watford site is emergency and some inpatient care, with some planned care being developed on two others, or being delivered from two other sites. So is that really a fair comparison for the piece of work that we've just had done?
I think it is. It's a complex comparison in that we're looking at the option that our shortlisting process, going from long list to shortlist, has looked at what the options are for emergency care and what the options are for planned care. And there are a number of options for emergency care and a number of options for planned care. And you can sort of knit and purl on each of those options as you go through. But the high-end comparison, we were looking, if we were moving the whole of the emergency services to an alternative site, then the potential opportunity is to take planned care with it as well. And that's something that we haven't considered in going from long list to short list. But in terms of giving an overall comparison at the really, really high end, the sort of £1 billion end of things, I think it does show a comparison to allow us to identify, as I think I said in the session on the Green Book, what the costs are and how they increase as we go between options, and therefore what the benefits are as we go between options, so that we can demonstrate for every pound we're spending, we're getting the maximum amount of benefit out of it. So if we spend £1 to get 80% of the benefits, the Treasury will look on that more favourably than if we spent £2 to get 100% of the benefits. Again, I hope that helps.
Thank you. We've had a
Can I
question
just come in
submitted. Oh, sorry, Helen. Yes.
Sorry, just briefly, just to be really, really clear that the site review compared the Watford sites and the Greenfield sites absolutely equally. They focused on what would it take to deliver an emergency care hospital on those sites, and the planning issues, the suitability, the timeline were all based on that. In fact, the review team also said that they believe that all of the sites would be capable of incorporating planned care as well, if that was something that you wanted to do, but it wouldn't materially change any of the issues that they raised, because the time taken to build a 90,000 square metre building isn't significantly different than the time taken to build a 100,000 square metre building. And likewise, the time taken to negotiate a commercial sale agreement or planning consent wouldn't be materially impacted, whether or not you chose to include planned care. So I just want to be clear that the review treated the sites equally, and the new site, Greenfield sites, were not disadvantaged in that review.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to stick with you, Helen, because I'm going to ask a question about the commissioning of the site feasibility study, which was something that we undertook before Dwayne was on board. And it may be an issue of our wording, but the questioner wants to know whether Royal Free, Montague Evans and Curry and Brown were in a consortium. Did we commission them all equally? Or did we just commission Royal Free and they brought on the other partners? So the questioner just wants to understand the mechanics of how it is that we had 3 parties working with us and who commissioned who. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's probably a fair comment. We used the word consortium in our engagement document because effectively it was the 3 parties working together to deliver the piece of work. We do have a relationship with the Royal Free Property Limited. They are supporting us as a programme team with our redevelopment, with a range of expertise that they bring from having recently successfully delivered the Chase Farm Hospital development. But they also have a range of expertise in the team that we don't have, and that we get the benefit of using through the NHS at what I would describe as very competitive rates compared to going out to a commercial market. So we do have an ongoing relationship with Royal Free Property Limited. They will work and support us through the redevelopment. One of the things that we do with them is access a range of broader expertise that they used again in their redevelopment at Chase Farm and other parts of their property portfolio that they look after. So effectively in this case, we said to the Royal Free, we want this piece of work doing. It's really important that it's independent, that it's credible, that it's professionally undertaken by people with appropriate professional qualifications. Maggie Robinson, who's one of the authors of the report, is the Director of Property for the Royal Free Property Limited, so she's a property specialist, and she then pulled together the team, including Montague Evans and Curry and Brown, to do the piece of work together. Tim, who's not on the call today, but I'm sure some people will recognise from previous sessions, who's our strategic estates lead at the Trust, had a number of conversations with Maggie about how they would pull together the appropriate expertise to do this piece of work. And I think we agreed together that Montague Evans would be a really good, suitable, independent advisory expert support to do this. And people will note that Curry and Brown, Montague Evans and Royal Free have all got their logos on the report, and they all will professionally stand by the work that was undertaken and the findings within the report.
Thank you. There's a question here about communication, so I'm going to just hopefully give some assurance on this. So people are worried about the future of outpatients and other appointments being very much digital, and that you have to communicate with us by media such as Zoom, like we're doing today, or Attend Anywhere. There's a whole range of packages that we're using now, and they do avoid patients needing to come to hospitals in many cases. But I would like to say that that isn't compulsory. We will be looking at the communication needs of patients, and as well as trying to really get moving with our big building project, we are doing a lot of work on our electronic patient record system, and that will really highlight to us the communication needs of our patients. So although technology is going to play a huge part in how healthcare changes, it doesn't mean that you have to engage with it through mobile phones, tablets, devices, whatever. So we will still be open to those patients who want to come and see us physically. So I'm just going to have a look at other questions that are coming in, and we do have a couple coming on chat. So although one is more about clinical services, Helen, I think I would ask you to explain our thinking on midwife-led units at St Albans and Hemel Hempstead, and if that is something that we have previously thought about and ruled out, and if so, why?
Yes, so we'd have to go back to 2017 when we were doing the work on the clinical model, the first set of work on the clinical model, and we did have a debate about different configurations of services. So for example, we talked at that time, or we looked at whether it was possible to sustain some emergency care services on the Hemel and St Albans sites, and again, I believe that report is on our website, but we can certainly, it will be pulled out and shared in the next set of work we do on the clinical model, specifically with midwife-led units. The proportion of so most women need either choose or need to give birth on a site where there's full 24/7 access to the range of specialties, including consultant obstetricians and all of the support services on this site. Many will choose a midwifery-led birth unit, but on a hospital site with all of that backup, because it's sort of the best of both worlds. You get a midwife-led experience, but know that you've got the safety of all of the clinical services there should you need it. The proportion of women who are comfortable having giving birth in a midwife what we would call a standalone midwifery-led unit is relatively small, and largely those women would be suitable to have a home birth. So generally the view and the discussion here with clinicians has been we want to focus on getting a really good midwifery-led unit alongside a really good obstetric-led unit with all of the backup of hospital services, and then focus on our home birth offer rather than a standalone midwifery-led centre, which would see relatively few women and have very high overheads to run and are difficult to staff. So that's effectively our view is, if you don't need to be in the hospital, then let's support you to have your baby at home.
Thank you. And not particularly related to this discussion, but a question that many people might be asking, which is about the minor injuries unit. So if you could just explain the rationale for keeping that closed temporarily and what the future of that unit might be, Helen.
Yes, so the reason the minor injuries unit at St Albans was closed during COVID was linked to the very real workforce challenge that we had, and also reduction in numbers of patients presenting at that time. So we took the decision to close the minor injuries unit. The staff were redeployed to work at Hemel Hempstead and on the Watford site here, and it was really all hands to the pump to manage the emergency, as well as very significant numbers of staff off sick. I think the question about why we haven't reopened it is twofold. Again, we're still seeing slightly lower numbers in terms of emergency care attendances on the Hemel site, you know, on the non-Watford sites. We're busy at Watford, and clearly you can't attend if the service isn't open. So I do recognise that that might sound like an odd thing to say, but overall the demand, we're able to manage the demand at Hemel. And then more importantly really than that, and some ongoing workforce challenges, is the fact that we really want the St Albans site to be what we call a green site, or as protected from COVID as it possibly can be. And therefore we're not running any walk-in services on that site at the current time.
Thank you. I'm going to let you have a big gulp of tea, but keep going with you, Helen, because I want to ask you also about the urgent care services on Hemel site, which are mentioned in our document. Do you have anything that you can update us on the urgent treatment centre at Hemel?
So the urgent treatment centre at Hemel, currently a key part of our service provision. Over the last kind of 18 months or so, a number of enhancements have been made to the service at Hemel to meet the national strategy around urgent treatment centres. So making sure that radiology is available for all of the opening hours of the urgent treatment centre being one example. It's absolutely our intention to retain the urgent treatment centre at Hemel and to keep developing the clinical services there. In terms of the redevelopment and the preferred option going forward into shortlist appraisal, it's the same as we described in 2019. It would involve a new build urgent treatment centre and investment in diagnostics onto on the Hemel site. It would also enable us then to free up the bottom half of the site to be available to be redeveloped as part of the town centre, but having a new purpose-built urgent treatment and diagnostics facility up closer to the Verulam wing.
Thank you, thank you. We also have had some questions on transport, which does always come up, and we will look at transport in much more detail once we are looking at the shortlist of options. So that is something that we will come back out to the stakeholder reference group with and ask for members who might be interested in joining a particular sort of focus group to really go into that topic in more detail. I should also say that unusually we are running out of questions, but we do have some time left. And one of the things that Helen discussed at the start of this meeting is how you ask your questions. And we've had a range of feedback, it has to be said, with some people saying that they actually prefer this format of me interpreting the questions because they do get their questions answered. They don't necessarily want to ask them themselves or be seen and heard asking them, and they find the environment quite conducive. They don't sort of want to be in a sort of aggressive, challenging environment, and they therefore favour this. But of course there are those who feel that they want to ask their question, they want to ask it directly, they want to ask it in their own words, and so that is something that we are thinking about. We have another one of these sessions looking at the site feasibility study and the shortlist, and we know that is something that people feel passionately about. So Helen, this is all a little bit on the hoof, but there are ways, perhaps if we ask people to raise their hand, if we put a question to them and people can raise their hand if in terms of sort of a vote for a yes, and then hopefully we can sort of try and determine that, and we can also follow up with a question to the stakeholder reference group to ask them how they want to do it in future. So Helen, would you be happy with us sort of trying out a question now while we've got the group here to ask them how they want to proceed for the next session? Oh, I think you're on mute.
I'm on mute. I am on mute. I'm saying I'm happy to give it a go, Louise. I'm not quite sure how it's going to work. But equally, we've got 10 minutes left. So if anybody did want to speak, we could also just offer that opportunity as a...
Okay, so I think what we'll do first of all is we'll ask a question. It'll just be one question, and if you raise your hand, we take that as a yes. And I've got also Priya and other people who are on the call who might have other. Do speak up, Priya, or let us know if you think you've got better ideas. Oh, we've got the yes button, of course. So hopefully under participants, people can find the yes button. So I'm going to ask some questions, and we're going to... I can't find the yes
button. You're going to have to explain it to us a bit more.
It should be under participants, and it's should have yes, no, go slower, go faster.
I've got it, Louise.
Excellent. Hopefully people have got that. I'm seeing nods. Excellent. Okay. So I'm going to ask two questions, and the first question is, do you wish to proceed through our next sessions using the chat function? With my interpretation might not always be good or as good as you would like, but are you happy to proceed on this basis for the next few sessions? Please say yes if that is the case. Thank you. And the second question is, would you like to see your fellow stakeholder reference group members and hear them in person, and for us to demute people when they have a question, and for people to ask their own questions in their own words? And if you could simply answer yes to that, if that's how you want to proceed in future. So we will take those results away. A bit of a mixed picture has to be said so far from what I can see. So we will take those away, and we will think about this for the next stakeholder reference group session. I'm just going to go back to the chat just to check that there aren't any questions that haven't been answered. And I think we have covered everything. Oh, hang on, 2 new messages. No, that's fine. There were just messages from colleagues here about the clinical strategy session, which is coming up on the week commencing the 21st of September. So perhaps, Helen, before we sign off, could you maybe give people a bit of a preview for the clinical strategy work and how that plays in to our grander project?
Yes, so we're doing 2 things at the moment. One is spending some time with our clinicians and with our partners and wider kind of stakeholders, saying big picture, what are the things that we should be focusing on as we think about how services are going to change in the future and how we want to deliver care differently. So, for example, how are we working to integrate care and join up care with other organisations, or how are we really working to personalise care for patients and make sure that it's really responsive. So some quite big picture themes. We're also talking to every specialty about how they see services developing and changing clinically over time. And we're getting into more and more detail then as we start to plan the hospital redevelopment into having to be working through a level of detail, what services on each site, exactly how many patients, exactly what the clinical pathway would look like. So our clinical strategy goes from quite big picture, what are strategically things that we're looking to develop and do differently, all the way through to quite granular detail about exactly which services would be developed on which site and what changes to the detail of how we operate would look like. we effectively will have two documents, one of which is a relatively higher level strategy that any hospital who perhaps wasn't in a redevelopment might look to publish on a reasonably regular basis. And then we've got a more detailed document that we call the clinical brief that describes the services on the 3 sites. So Claire and Esther, who are the 2 people who are leading this work, will be sharing their thinking with you at the next meeting. It is, so there's quite a lot of detail there, but it's not all finished and all written down yet. So they'll be sharing where we're at, they'll be wanting to get people's views, they'll want to know what's important, and then over the next 2 months they'll be developing a strategy document and finalising the clinical brief, and there'll be lots of opportunities to get engaged with that over the next few months.
Thank you. And Helen and Dwayne, if I can just slip in a question that has come from a letter or a comment from a local MP in a letter to both of you, just to get your sort of take on it. And it's the risk really of delay. So the letter from Mike Penning, which is a published document, so I'm not betraying any confidences here. He has talked about whether it would be better to go into the next wave of funding and to move from what we call HIP 1 into HIP 2. So both of you, I'd really like your view on risk, if you wouldn't mind, before we sign off. Thank you. Helen?
Yeah, so I'm going to start and I'm going to talk about clinical risk of trying to deliver the services in the buildings that we're currently trying to deliver services from, and how much longer we can keep doing that. So set aside the issue about HIP 1 funding, what we can secure, some of the politics around that, and I might ask Dwayne to pick that aspect up. But regardless of that, we believe that we urgently need to improve our facilities, and we therefore think we should choose options that we believe we can deliver in a 5 to 6 year time period, and that anything that would take significantly longer than that means delaying and continuing to provide care in facilities that are really difficult for patients and really difficult for staff, and regularly we see what we call business continuity incidents, but things that make it difficult and interrupt service delivery, and we think it's urgent. So forget the politics for a minute, we think it's urgent. I'm going to ask Dwayne to say about HIP 1, HIP 2, securing the most money, and give him a chance.
Thank you, Helen. It's a difficult judgment. A former chief executive of mine, who I worked with some years ago, was keen to progress a particular redevelopment that we were working on at that time. And his or her, so that I don't give anything away, view was all these promises are written in pencil. And at any point, any project can have the eraser taken to it. So yes, theoretically, we could go from HIP 1 to HIP 2. I think as an organisation, we'd need to be convinced that if we keep looking, as we have done for a number of years, at potentially available sites, as Mr. Penning has suggested, why would we actually keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome? Because certainly all the information that I've seen that's been developed over the last 4 or 5 years has been done in some quite significant detail, and each time we've looked at it, the outcome hasn't changed hugely. So my nervousness, and I think my nervousness for patients and for staff within the trust as well, would be we end up going to the very back of the queue for little benefit. Now, that's going to be a controversial view, and I know that not everyone will like what I've just said. However, it has the benefit of a bit of openness and honesty.
Thank you very much, Dwayne. Thank you for leaving us on that note of clarity. So before I go, can I just urge you to fill in a survey if you haven't already done so. Please read the briefing document to give yourself all the context that you need to be able to respond, and we'll be seeing you again, I'm sure. So thank you very much for your time this morning. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.